Hello, I'm Sally Wiener Grotta, and this is What If, Why Not, How? Where I ask people who have interesting stories and ideas questions that are on my mind.
My guest today is Scott Edelman, author, editor, and general bon vivant, who has a remarkable list of accomplishments. For the sake of time, I'm going to run through only some highlights. In a review of his recently released book, Things That Never Happened, Publishers Weekly wrote, quote, his talent is undeniable, unquote, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. His collection of zombie fiction, What Will Come After, was a finalist for the Shirley Jackson Memorial Award. He has been a Stoker Award finalist 8 times, both in the category of short fiction and long fiction. He's also the author of the Lambda Award-nominated novel, The Gift. 100, well, it's more than that now. As of a little while ago, 120 of his short stories have been published in numerous magazines and anthologies, but I know there's quite a few in the pipeline, and who knows how many we're going to have by the end of 2024. But that's not all. Scott has been an editor of several magazines, including Science Fiction Age and various Sci-Fi Channel publications, and all that has resulted in him being a four-time Hugo Award finalist for Best Editor. And that's a tough one. Just to be nominated there is amazing. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention his ever-popular Eating the Fantastic Interview podcast, where he invites listeners to eavesdrop on his meals and great conversations with creators of science fiction, fantasy, horror, comics, and just about everything else. Now I get to turn the table on Scott Edelman. Well, at least the interview spotlight. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And after an introduction like that, perhaps I should suggest to any listeners they should bail now, because anything to come is going to be underwhelming, and there is no way that I can live up to an introduction like that. So,
except I've been in conversations with you, and your stories are always wonderful. I love hearing you talk, and I'm so delighted you could join me today.
Well, I'm honored by the invitation, so I'm glad to be here.
You've had quite a career, and you've seen a lot of changes in the overall speculative fiction world. Speculative, for those who don't know the phrase, has to do with any what-if issues, science fiction, fantasy, horror, magical realism, anything that is seemingly not grounded in this world, but it's always about this world under the covers. I'd love to talk a little bit about your beginnings. When you were young, you worked for both, am I correct, both Marvel and DC Comics? Is that correct?
I wrote comic books for both of them. I was only on staff as an editor at Marvel, and none of this would have happened had I not been lucky enough to have been raised in New York. I grew up in Brooklyn. The conventions at the time were only a subway token away, so I went to my first comic book convention at age 15.
Oh.
So to talk about seeing changes that have occurred in various fields, comics as well as science fiction, the first convention I went to only had a few hundred people at it, and that was the largest convention that existed. I still have the program book. I think it had 238 members who had signed up in advance, and there were another 100 or so at the door, but it was extremely small. And I got to meet many of the people who worked in comics at the time, and saw it when it was small, and you could pick up comic books more cheaply and artwork more cheaply, and saw the whole transition into things like San Diego Comic-Con, where they would have 175,000 people instead of just a few hundred. And then I went to my first science fiction convention in 1971, so I was 16 years old. People can do the math and figure out where I am now. That would have been LunaCon, also in that same hotel, the Statler Hilton Hotel in Manhattan, across the street from Penn Station, which is now a hole in the ground. They finally, after all these years, have torn down the hotel. It used to be I go to New York and go and stare at that Statler Hilton Hotel, which became the Hotel Pennsylvania and the Penn Hotel.
Yeah.
Say that's where it all began for me. And in 1972, I went to the first Star Trek convention that ever happened, which was again in that same hotel. So
Wow.
it was a hotel with a lot of history for comic books and for science fiction. And it's now no more. So the last time I went to New York, I just sort of stood there. I have no
Wow.
idea what they're building in its place, but it finally came down, I think only 2 to 3 years ago. But that particular, there's a hallowed ground there for people who were New Yorkers and for the beginnings of comic book fandom.
So, what are some of the comic books, some of the heroes and such that you wrote stories for?
Well, the very first comic book I got to write was a comic book character called the Scarecrow, a supernatural character who basically was protecting Earth by being imbued in a painting that's separated from one dimension and the other. And it was all part of the horror boom. And I ended up writing that because I was an assistant editor working at Marvel Comics. And often when they needed a comic book written or, oh, gee, we have some extra pages, they would ask, do you got any ideas? And that was when I did the comic book that I wrote. The longest though was Captain Marvel. I wrote for a year and a half. Not the, and if
Wow.
you've seen the movie, it's not that Captain Marvel because there was a period when Captain Marvel was a guy who ended up dying several decades ago, and now we have Carol Danvers is the Captain Marvel. But one of the characters I invented with the artist Al Milgrom in the pages of Captain Marvel was a character called Dr. Minerva, who was played by Gemma Chan in the Captain Marvel movie. So
Okay.
it took me 40 years before I saw one of the characters make it to the screen. But I also wrote tons of stories for House of Mystery, House of Secrets. These were anthology books that basically were like horror anthologies, except in comic
Hmm.
book form. They would have multiple 5-page stories.
Oh.
And, after a while of writing comic books, because I originally wanted to write just short stories, and it's really just an accident that I ever got the job in comics at all. I was there in comic book fandom, never thinking I'd work in comics, just wanting to be a short story writer and reading the early Clarion anthologies that were edited by Kate Wilhelm and Robin Scott
Mm, yes.
Wilson and other people. And I figured I'd go to Clarion. The funny thing was, I applied to Clarion in 1974. I was age 19, people doing the math, was turned down. And in 1974, I started working just a few months or a month or two after I would have gone to Clarion at Marvel. They offered me a job. I was not looking for a job
Wow.
because some things maybe you don't want to see how the sausage is made. Sometimes the things you love, you just want to love. That
Hmm.
was not the job I thought. That was not the writer I thought I was going to be. My plan going to college was I was going to be someone like New Yorkers may remember these people, Pete Hamill
Oh,
or Jimmy
yeah.
Breslin,
Hmm.
3 times a week newspaper columnists who would just wander the city and get in chats with people of the neighborhood and write about what their lives were like, 800 words a column 3 times a week, things like that. I guess it would be like Studs Terkel if you're from
Hmm.
Chicago, right? Each city had their own
Yes.
person who really had their finger on the pulse of the city, and I always thought I was going to be one of those. And it turned out the comic book people offered me a job, meaning I was not applying for a job. This is
Wow.
the thing about just being around because you cannot, if let's say you just graduated college with your English degree and you wanted to work in publishing, and or you could be a proofreader or a copy editor. Well, you couldn't do that role for comic books because when you're proofreading comic books, you are saying, well, does the webbing look right under Spider-Man's arm? Does the footnote
Mm.
on the bottom of the panel that says when it goes, well, remember the Fantastic Four fought Doctor Doom in issue number 12 or whatever, and you say, well, that's not the right number. There are certain things you have to know. Oh, the belt buckle is wrong on the Submariner, and you only know that from a lifetime of reading comics since you were a little kid. So they needed someone to come in, and I was hired to be the assistant editor of the British reprint books, and it took off from there. But after a while, I said, no, I got to get back to my true first love of the short story because
Hmm.
it was tough when. If someone told you every single thing you could possibly write and hand it in by Friday, I will give you a check for on Wednesday. It is difficult to and it's not. It might be a comic book. It might be letter columns. It might be advertising. It might be a calendar. I wrote these Slurpee cups when I was at Marvel. If anybody went to 7-Eleven during the 70s, on one side I had a picture of a comic book character. On the other side, it had their little biography. I wrote 60 of those one summer. So all sorts of strange little. I wrote a comic book that Marvel did for Carvel. Sometimes comic book I wrote. They did for Ovaltine. Marvel would subcontract doing comic books for them. So
And these were given as bonuses to consumers, right?
yes, that kind of yeah. If you sent in for Ovaltine, if you sent in some wrappers from the jar or whatever, and it would become difficult that if you said, well, yeah, I could write on this short story that might sell in 6 months, a year, 5 years, never, after I'm dead, or this stuff, and I realized I just couldn't do it, so I reapplied to Clarion in 1979 and said, "Rescue me." Literally, if you went back and read my essay, you have to submit an essay and a submission story, and I'm sure the essay convinced them more than the story. And it basically said, I haven't written my short fiction since working in comics because I'm just, writing everything they want me to write. I need to get back to the short stories and not just write these horror stories for these comic book anthologies. I need to write them for myself. And they took me, and that sort of was a change, and I got back into writing short fiction and came back from Clarion, and I think I sold my first short story in 1981, so that's 42 years ago. And here we are in 2023, the waning days of 2023.
2024 is just around the corner, and I'm still writing 2019 on my checks. But I write the few times I write checks. I'd be curious, what did you learn from working on comics that has influenced your writing and editing since? What did you take away from the experience? I know there's this feeling that you weren't doing what you were meant to do, but it must have been quite a good learning experience too.
Oh, it was definitely a good learning experience. Well, one, just being exposed to all of those writers in real life. Outside of whatever you're doing in comics, if you were hanging around with people who really knew what they were doing as writers, you're talking about all sorts of things as it came to convincing someone to wanting to read what you want to write. But, some things that you learn in comics, when I went to Clarion, for example, Damon Knight said, "Oh, you're so good at dialogue from writing those comic books." Comic books were mostly a lot of dialogue. And it's like, but I don't necessarily want to do the things that I'm good at. I want to do the things that I'm bad at so I can get better. I've always felt that if you only play to your strengths, people always say play to your strengths, and I think play to your weaknesses. Because you want to raise the level of your weaknesses. So, because let's say you're great at setting, but you're lousy at characterization and you're good at dialogue, well, you've got to raise it all so it's all pretty equal. So, a lot of the things that I learned in comics were pacing, obviously, playing with the language. Comic books, though, did a lot of things that you don't necessarily want to do in your regular fiction because, in a comic book, I assume most people know what a comic book is like. You often have a splash page, and the splash page is meant to draw everyone in. Often, a lot of comic book splash pages are flashbacks. So to highlight the most exciting part of the story that is still to come later on in the story. And you don't want to necessarily start your stories farther in and then go back, meaning if you always go starting with a flashback and then going back to where you're supposed to start, well, maybe you haven't started, in the right place. Comic books taught you some concision. Unlike now, when I start a story, or most of the time when I start a story, I don't know what it's going to be. Is it going to be 3,000 words or 8,000 words? I believe you and I may have spoken about this in the past. I thought you were pretty good at no, you're not. Okay.
Well, no, I am a pantser like that. I know the beginning. I know the first sentence. I know my character's name and her problem, and I almost always know the ending. I haven't the foggiest idea how I'm going to get to the ending.
Right. So we're both pantsers, but some people are very good. If I said, "Okay, Scott, I need a 5,000 word story on robots," or whatever. Some people could do that. I can't. But with a comic book, it's whatever it was. whether at the time I was writing comics, I think they were 20 pages long or 18 pages long
Right.
at various times, the story. So you couldn't write something that was 22 pages. It had to fit
Yes.
in that space. It could not
Yeah.
overflow unless it was an ongoing
Right.
story, which generally you try to fit in those pages. But with my short stories, it's, well, is it 2,000, 5,000, is it 10,000? Will it be a novel? Well, not for me. It won't be a novel. So I began to teach concision and fitting things down, and but there were some things it didn't teach because you have a partner when you're writing comics. You have an artist. So you're not learning as much about description. You were describing things to the artist so the artist can draw it. But as a writer, where you're in 100% control, as a prose writer, when you're 100% in control of what the audience sees, you have to be able to describe what the characters look like and what the rooms will look like, not in an overbearing way.
Right.
Which you did learn in comics, because in comics you might say to the artist, okay, this is what the room they're in looks like, and you're describing everything they have to draw. You would not tell a reader every single thing that's in the room. You would only tell them what was necessary for them to understand what was going on, which is a wonderful, someone told me this story from Ted Sturgeon. I don't know how many people it went through to get from Ted Sturgeon to me, but he always said that when you have the room that a character is in, you have it in your head. You only describe the aspects of the room that character would have noticed in their mental state and based on who they are. So, if that character's angry, they might notice something that they might not notice if they're happy. Depending on them. Oh, look at those smudges on the lampshade or whatever. And you're not describing it all. And the reader, from these little clues, will put together a picture of that room in their own head, which will not at all be the same picture that you have in your head, but somehow will be the right picture. So don't be a completist in description. And I thought that was wonderful, that, have it all in your head, but, insert the character into the scene, have the character experience it, and that will give you a full accounting of what their room is. But in comic books, that was not a skill that you learned. You had to, so that's one of the reasons to leave. You had to, get out of comics to begin learning that skills. Because that's one of the cheats that happens in comics sometimes. Some artists, for example, this is a metaphor about going for your weaknesses. There are some artists that are not very good at drawing feet or at hands, let's say.
They're the hardest things there in the world to draw.
And they will figure out, how can I draw this panel telling the story without showing it? And I know there was one character who couldn't really draw horses very well. So when someone would show up on a horse, it would often be the characters on the panel would go, oh, look, here he comes on that horse. And then you wouldn't have to the horse. But so things like that taught me to the things that I'm not good at are the things that I want to write. And it may mean that the next story might not be as good as it could or should be, but it will increase my skills. So for the following story, I'll be better. That the story is part of a continuum of one's career, and I think new writers should always think about that. The single story is not the be-all and end-all. It might be the story where you're meant to learn a particular skill from, so that when you finally get to the story where you need to know setting and characterization and plot and your style and everything, it will all come together by then. And as you may have noticed by now, you can ask a question and I can just go on and on. You never ask another question. So I should learn to shut up every once in a while, because I can segue from one to the other. I was at a Baltimore Comic-Con right before the pandemic began, and Jim Steranko, one of the idols of my youth, an artist writer who I met in 1970 at my very first convention, he was being interviewed by someone. This would have been in 2019 at Baltimore Comic-Con. And the interviewer asked him a question, and Jim was answering and segueing from one anecdote to another anecdote. I said, I wonder when will that interviewer be able to ask the next question? And it wasn't until 48 minutes in the hour that he finally shut up and let the interview end. And I should probably learn a lesson from that anecdote, because well, it's sort of like a hologram where it's all a single piece my entire career. So if you can ask me a question, just wind me up and I'll keep going.
Well,
but you may snap that whip. Snap that whip here. And,
I was actually depending on that when I was preparing for this, because I know your stories are wonderful. I do want to give a definition to our listeners for those who don't know what a pantser is. There are those writers who outline everything they're going to write, and they follow the outline beautifully. Then there's people like Scott and me, where we have an idea and it forms as we write. And it just, it comes from what I call the creative chaos that's in your head, and you get it down on paper or on the screen these days.
Yeah, and part is the process, and part is where the joy comes from.
Right,
Because
yes,
for me, the joy in writing the story is learning what the story is and helping
yes,
the story be born. I'm a midwife,
yes,
and Peter
yes,
Straub, the late great Peter Straub, once said, "As soon as I know what's on the other side of the crevasse, I no longer feel the need to build a bridge to it." And that to me is perfect. If I,
that
in
is
my
great.
head, perfectly plotted out point by point what each scene should be, and I was just having a
Hmm.
conversation with someone about that who went to Taoist Toolbox, which is a
Yes,
particular writer's workshop and they help people break out the beats of their novels. So one of the things they do during that week when this person was away was they would actually take the novel and just as in television, where if anyone's ever seen what a television board looks like, if you've seen behind the scenes video, they will make a little index card of every single thing that happens and be moving them around on the wall until they know every beat and everything that happens in every scene, and only then will they begin to
yeah.
write. And I could never do that.
Well, I can't do that because I feel like my characters write my stories. And so I have to listen to them. And the only time I actually have what is called writer's block is when I've pushed my character into a place where that person should not be. And so she can't talk me out of it. And by the way, I just wanted to get the word pantser comes from writing by the seat of your pants,
Yes,
is
yes.
essentially. Um, I want to talk to you about a little bit about magazines because
Okay.
you've been the head you've been at the helm of some rather interesting magazines, and you were the founding editor of Science Fiction Age, if I remember correctly.
Yes, yes.
That's
First
early
issue back in
90s,
1992. Yeah, first issue in
92.
1992, last issue 2000. So it's a bi-monthly magazine.
Do you think it was a simpler time in publishing than it is now, or would you? Publishing has changed tremendously in the recent years. And
Let me tell you something about the internet. For those people who are listening to this, are not listening to this in person. They're not sitting in an
mhm,
audience in a
yeah.
hotel somewhere at a convention listening. They're listening to on this thing called the internet. And this is how publishing changed. I was editing Science Fiction Age magazine for 8 years, and it did very well. I won a Nebula.
Yeah.
I didn't win a Nebula, but one of my writers, the very first year of publishing, Martha Sukup, won a Nebula for a story I published, and the final year, Mary Tuzilla won a Nebula for a story I published. So I was very glad for
Hmm.
that. It was a print magazine. Then I went to a magazine called Satellite Orbit, which for people who have satellite dishes and watch TV on satellite dishes. And then I was invited again. It came to me an opportunity. I've been very lucky.
Mm.
I was asked if I wanted to work for the Sci-Fi Channel in
Yeah.
2000, editing Science Fiction Weekly, which is an internet magazine, and talking about how much things have changed. I'm offered this job when I was asked, "Do you know anyone who wants this job, or would you like this job? You don't have to come to New York. It can be done remotely."
Hmm.
And I had to sit and think, "Gee, the internet is that going to be around?" And I remember I actually did for my wife and my son. I made a little wall chart of the pros and cons. Like okay, this was in. I started working there. Let's see. I had the interview at the World Science Fiction Convention in the year 2000 in Chicago. So
Hmm.
this would have been the summer of 2000, and I actually had to pause and think. Did it make sense to work for a internet magazine? What is an internet magazine? How are they making money? No one's buying this thing. Where
Yes.
is the money for my salary coming from? How will this last? Will this internet thing? I don't understand. I actually had to do a chart. And it finally came to the position that, well, you worked for print magazines that got canceled. So if you work for an internet magazine that dies, well, what's the difference? And you've learned skills. You've learned how to do HTML. You've learned a variety of other things. But the thought that anyone would think this is now 23 years ago. Well, would an internet job make sense? And could there be internet magazines when now there are so many? There's Lightspeed and Clark's World and Nightmare and Strange Horizons and Uncanny and on and on and on. So all wonderful magazines, and some of the, and yes, the traditional legacy print magazines like Asimov's and Analog are still here, but the internet electronic magazines have taken up so much of the slack. There's probably more being published by internet magazines than print magazines, and it
Yeah.
has really changed the whole nature of both the creative side of things and the economic side of things. Not that there's nothing creative about figuring out how to sell the magazines, but there are changes in all of those things.
What are some of the changes that you feel are significant, and how has it actually changed? Do you feel it's changed the type of writing that's being done?
Well, what it has opened the door for many other people. That's one of the wonderful things in two ways, both from the editing, publishing a magazine from their side, and from being a writer trying to sell stories side. I mean, from the editing, publishing, the bar economically, I think, has been lowered towards launching a magazine, so it is allowed for more magazines to be started, for wider, diverse voices, both from the writing, but just from the editorial side as well, to have very narrowly focused instead of broadly focused. It's sort of the way that cable happened, that you start having narrow focused channels instead of having to publish something that has the widest possible, lowest common denominator audience possible. So it allowed for let 1,000 flowers bloom, as they say. So you had all these magazines that were starting up that's so wonderful. It changed because now writers in other countries attempting to sell to U.S. magazines no longer had to put things in envelopes, get international reply coupons, which is what we used to do with postage. And the other day, when you couldn't get the postage to mail the manuscript back, you bought this coupon that you sent along with your manuscript that the recipient could translate into their local postage to send it back. So it has really changed the bar for allowing international voices. I mean, we have seen some amazing writers from all around the world, and a lot of that has come from the diligence and the hard work done by certain publisher editors who were proactively trying to find those voices, and simply just from the change in allowing electronic submissions. Once the non-electronic publications like Atmos and Analog began to accept electronic publications, that changed things tremendously. So so basically that's one of the many changes, because there are all these people who say, oh, there used to be 35 or 40 or 50 pulp size, not even pulp size, post pulp, because fantasy science fiction isn't really the size of a pulp. We call it a pulp magazine because it's sort of on pulp paper, but people think slightly larger. But there used to be 35 or 50 magazines. If you go back and look at the locus charts, and now we just have a small handful of print. But there's one magazine that I was published in that published in multiple formats, meaning they will publish a story for free online for you to read immediately. They will sell you a Mobi that you can get and carry around on your Kindle, and they will also print a physical copy for people who want that way. So they actually have multiple revenue streams to be able to pay themselves and pay the writers. So a whole lot has changed. If I were going to start a magazine now, I would not go to paper myself.
How would you earn the money to pay the writers then?
Well, the way people are doing with Patreons, people are doing it with fundraisers. People are trying. Advertising is not really there. There are some of them are printing annuals. Where I know Daily Science Fiction used to do that at the end of the year. They would print an annual of all their, because those are very short stories, but they would put that together.
Right.
So there are other revenue streams, and it will also mean you could publish fewer things. I had Neil Clark was on my podcast, and we were talking about launching Clark's World in 2006. I think he said when he started it was 2 stories a month.
Right.
You can't publish a magazine that would appear on the newsstand with 2 stories a month. Giganotosaurus is another magazine. I think they publish 1 story a month. Good stories, but it's only 1 story a month. So it allows for different presentations of things as well.
Are you ever tempted to go back into the magazine publishing world?
Well, the number of hours in the day are not there for everything. I'm always tempted, and I was very lucky that the science fiction age ended up ceasing publication because the profit was insufficient for the company that I was working for. They were publishing a whole variety of magazines, including nonfiction, sci-fi movie magazines and TV magazines. And so they said, no, we're not. That one isn't as profitable as these, so we're not going to publish that anymore. I might have stayed with that company and not have returned back to doing more writing. We have choices we have to make, unfortunately.
Yes.
And luckily, I found that the podcast does not interfere with the writing. And my travels to conventions doesn't interfere with the writing. But often the editorial job, I had to actually quit an editorial job a couple of years ago when I recognized that I couldn't do it. It wasn't fiction. That's a wonderful toy to play with. Like, remember Orson Welles and Citizen Kane losing money on the newspaper, and he said it's the greatest train set you could ever give a kid is editing a newspaper. Something like that, he says in there. And so I was editing a weekly newsletter for Shudder, SHUDDR, not SUTTER, the streaming horror service. And I recognized that even doing a weekly newsletter, it was eating up my subconscious.
Yes.
And I don't know where your story ideas come from, but like just last night, I woke up in the middle of the night and said, oh, I know what I have to do on this short story. So much of my work is done by my unindicted co-conspirator, my subconscious.
Yes.
And when I was editing that magazine, even though it was a weekly, and previously I edited 4 bi-monthly magazines, and I discovered editing one weekly newsletter took up as much of my subconscious as the 4 bi-monthly magazines, so that I would wake up, let's say it was Halloween. Oh, what can we do on Halloween? Oh, the 13 most disgusting candies, or the scariest vampire, or things like that. And I was continually waking up, thinking of ways to improve this weekly newsletter instead of waking up.
Right.
I'll wake up with the next sentence. That's why you mentioned writer's block and pantsing. And when I come to, I really don't know where I should come next. I'm just going to stop right now and not push it. Some people can push through and they'll just say, I'm going to stare at this keyboard or whatever. And I say, no, I'll go to sleep. It'll happen. Or I'll juggle, or I'll play the ukulele, or I'll do something that occupies, or I'll take a hike. I often wake up in the morning and I know the next 2 or 3 sentences, or like I'll finish a scene, I don't know what the next scene is, and I will wake up knowing the opening sentence or 2 of the next scene. And somehow my brain got shaken up while I was asleep and it came to me. And that's why I really don't have writer's block. I just think of it, okay, well, I'll just wait. And sometimes I do push at it, because when I say, I have no idea what happens next, I'm going to allow myself to be stupid, and I'm going to pull out my notebook and write down every possible thing. And I might have 20 different things. Oh, they all get hit by a bus. I put down no matter how stupid it is, and somewhere in there, you'll find it. And I've heard James Patrick Kelly, a wonderful writer, who people should all read. He was telling me about something that he does and what he tells students when he teaches. See, all my wisdom is just other people's wisdom passing through me. So that's, he said, when you think of the ending to the story, always ask yourself, am I sure? And he said, write down 10 possible other ways it could have ended. Really make sure. Maybe you were right. Maybe that was the ending. But he said, just keep going and come up and allow yourself to think of the silliest thing you possibly can. Then you might, yes, now that's how it's supposed to end. So that's really the one ending that is both perfect for that story and unexpected for that story at the same time. So sometimes I do some of that if I'm really, but often it's just let it go and be very zen about it. If you don't fight it, it's like those finger cuffs we had as children, which when we were children had an inappropriate name I will not repeat.
Yes, but you pulled on it and it held on.
The harder you pulled, the more difficult it was. They were sort of woven bamboo, or I don't know, whatever, with thistles or something, and if you pulled, they tightened, and the only way you could get them off your fingers was by relaxing and letting go, and they fell off. So that's sort of my psychology for dealing with my
Hmm.
writing. That if I don't rush it or don't push it, you can break something. It's like pushing too hard on something and it cracks. I just
Yeah, yeah.
let
I
it
find,
go. Que
hmm
sera, sera.
yeah, I find stream of consciousness often helps with that. Just,
Yeah.
just, just write whatever comes. Auto writing, in other words, just write whatever comes, and eventually, I write myself into the right place.
Yeah, I
But
had to do that. The story I published in January of this year in Lightspeed with a title so long, it is 38 words long, so I am not going to attempt to recount it off the top of my head. It starts with a man walks into a bar, and it is a story that I wrote that I literally had to give myself permission to write because I said no one is ever going to want to read this story. It is too strange and too personal. It's a story about my father, a fantasy
oh,
story about my father, which sort of explains why I love him so much, loved him so much. Well, I still love him. He's not here anymore
yeah.
to receive the love, but and I said no one's going to want to read this story, but I think I need to write it
Hmm.
just to have written it and get it out. And it's the only story I've ever written that after it was done, I said, now what? Normally, I don't know about you, when I finish a story, I sort of have an idea
Hmm.
who I want it to be published by. It may not
Hmm.
be the right one because they may reject it, but it may be, okay, I think I'm going to try Asimov's with this one first, or I'm going to try Lightspeed, or whoever it
Hmm.
is. This is an analog story. This one I finished and I said, no one will want to buy this story. And I actually had to share it with a couple of my friends and say, well, what do I do with this? Is anyone going to want to publish this? Or should I just throw it up on my blog so that people can read it? And I was told, oh, John Joseph Adams seems to be willing to publish quite experimental, other more unusual
Hmm.
stories.
Hmm.
And he published it. He bought it. He's the first and only person who bought it. It was published on January 5th of this year, and another character is in that other than my father, and I will lead people to guess who that other character might be if I were to say that when it published on January 5th, I said maybe it'll make you feel better about January 6th, for which what January 6th means in the public imagination is these days, but it's an encounter my father has with a certain infamous person. And
Oh.
you'd have to read the story just to see, but that was available to be read for free. And when I say it's 36 words long, I think 160 characters long, so I should have written it down in advance. But it's Lightspeed, and I was very happy that not only did he publish it, but Gizmodo, who reprints one
Hmm.
story from Lightspeed a month, chose that story to
Wow.
be the one they gave an extra boost for. So
Well,
I was
I
very
find
happy with that.
I find often it's the specific story, the stories that are rooted in something very personal to the writer, that it has dose of reality. It's not as ethereal. It has a foundation and it has a solidity that an emotional solidity, I should say, that readers respond to. And sometimes they're the hardest things to write, and sometimes they're the easiest things to write. But that the emotional power of telling a story about your father, I'm looking forward to reading this. This has to have been definitely a compelling story in my mind. And I can understand your uncertainty about it, but I also can understand my certainty
Yes.
about it.
Yes. Well, and the thing about writing, and the thing also that writers have to keep in mind is, well, who do they want to be? You pick up a book and it will say, in the tradition of
Yes,
J.R.R. Tolkien, or in the tradition of Agatha Christie, or in the tradition of this. Well, then you're in a shadow, right? Then
yes.
you're following a market.
Hmm.
Don't you want to be in the tradition of you?
Yes, yes.
But if you're doing that, because some writers will say, well, let me try and figure out what editors want, and let me write that thing.
Hmm.
But if you're doing that, you're sort of hiding part of you. And this is one reason. See, I always think of myself as not a motivational speaker to teach people how to succeed. I think of myself as a motivational speaker teaching people how to deal with the fact that they're not succeeding and be happy with that. Once you've made a decision, as I do, to not write to market
Yeah.
and to write whatever the heck I feel like, you cannot be pressed for not having sold your stories because you're not attempting to say, I'm going to figure out exactly what that editor wants and exactly what their weak spot is and fit in there and be a chameleon and be that kind of story. If you're just trying to say, well, I'm going to write what makes me me, it can be a more difficult road. But as I tell people, you're not going to be able to probably, unless you're a rarity, you're not going to be able to earn enough money from your writing to buy a house or a car or something like that. The average income of a writer is not that hard. Wouldn't you rather do it saying the things that you want to say in your own voice rather than saying the things other people want you to say in their voice? And that's sort of why I got the comics. That's part of going back, 40 years ago, that I say, no, I just want to do what I want to do, and luckily I'm at the point where I can do that. Um, and then I'm also lucky that I can do that, and that I care more about short stories and novels. If I were a novelist, then writing 100,000 words, and maybe some of them want it, maybe some of them not want it. As with my stories, some sell the first time out, like that one we were just talking about that went to Lightspeed. Others sell the 20th time out, or the 25th. I have some of the stories that are my favorites. I have a story that I absolutely adore that I think it says what I want it to say.
Yeah.
No one ever says, "Oh, we're rejecting this because you could fix it and do this or that or the other." It's just, it is what it is, and you know, and too much about. I probably told you the food analogy. I could bake the world's greatest blueberry pie and give it to you, and you could say, "You know what would make this better if you scraped all the blueberries out and put apples inside." Because I don't like blueberries. I said, no, but I want to bake a blueberry pie.
Yeah.
If you can't tell me how to make a better blueberry pie, like if you told me, oh, if you did this with the dough on your blueberry pie, it would be better, or oh, if you cooked it a little bit longer, or too much sugar, not enough sugar to make me. That's what an editor should tell you, how to make your thing be your thing better, and actually take what's in your head and put it on the paper. Not, oh well, I don't like blueberries. Can you bake me something else? So that always comes back to food with me. But that's sort of the way I feel. That's what I'm looking for with editors. That I want them, if they're going to point something out.
Well, one of my most significant mentors is my now deceased husband, who used to say that it's whether or not you're the duck or the swan in the pond. That it depends upon whose pond you're in. And it doesn't have to do with what you've written. It has to do with what they're expecting you to write. And I have never been a person who wants to be predictable. So I am often the ugly duckling in the pond. But I'm still very proud of the work I've done. And I generally eventually find my pond for each.
Right. Yeah. And if you are confident and have said what you want to say, when someone says, this does not meet our needs, you don't get depressed. Okay, so it didn't meet their needs, and it is true that it just didn't say. I mean, how often do you, just as a reader, forget this writing jazz? I mean, if you're a reader, how often do you read a book or a short story that you go, oh my God, I must tell every single person I know how magnificent the story was? All an editor is someone who gets paid for finding unpublished ones and doing that. It really should be that level of love.
Yes.
And to not have achieved that level of love is not a shameful thing. It could still be a great story. It's just they didn't absolutely fall in love with it.
But the next one may do it. I may fall in love with it, and I like it when an editor will say, "Oh, love your writing as always. Doesn't fit me." That's fine. That's fine. And I've never had an insulting rejection, and I've never had I've actually had mostly praiseworthy rejections, but there's still nobody wants a rejection, but then you move on to the next one and the next one. But unfortunately, I am a long-form writer primarily. So like the novel that I'm working on. That's
difficult for pantsing, So pantsing a novel, that's maybe why I have never had I've written one novel, but the only novel I have ever published was written by accident. It was a short story. And then I kept revising it, and it got longer. And I didn't save it, but it was originally it's like a 3,000 word short story, and then the next draft was 10,000 words, and then I wrote, and then suddenly it's 25. As I'm filling in all the interstitial things. Oh, I like to know this that happens, and let's add this other scene to
Yeah.
explain that.
That's
It
the
ended up
gift.
being that's a
That,
gift. It ended up
yeah.
being 110,000 words long,
And an
and
award and award worthy too.
it was a finalist for the Lambda
Yeah.
Award,
Yeah.
gay science fiction and fantasy that year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but it was an accident as opposed to anything deliberate, which is really weird.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I will ever do a novel, but yet you never know. I mean, the
Never.
novel, to give kudos to some people coming up or advertising to people coming up, the novel I am most looking forward to this year, Kelly Link's first novel,
Oh,
The Book
that'll
of
be
Love,
fabulous.
comes out in February. Now, here's a short story writer people only know from short stories, decades and decades of short stories, one of the
Mhm.
greatest living short story writers, won the
Mhm.
MacArthur Genius Award,
Right.
and has never written a novel. And you figure, well, maybe there won't be a novel. Maybe that's not this person's desire, as having
Mhm.
a novel, and not just a novel. I believe I pre-ordered it on Kindle. I believe it's something like 680 pages long.
Oh
So when
my.
someone who's devoted their entire life only to short stories suddenly out of nowhere surprises you with a novel, you've got to say, okay, attention must be paid. There must be something worth saying. So I guess I can never say never if Kelly Link will eventually write a novel. But I'm really, I see short story. I'm a miniaturist, minimalist. I'm not a minimalist. Maybe more a miniaturist.
What are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on a short talk about sitting up in bed and thinking of things that you're working on. I'm working on a short story. I don't like describing the details of the short
No, it's
story
okay.
because I am like I can have my teapot anyway. It lets the steam out and then the boiling goes away.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
I'm about 3,000 words into a short story that might be 5,000 words, and I woke up and I suddenly said, "Gee, maybe this should be first person instead of third person."
Oh
But
my.
but I think the only way I can be sure, and this is going to be weird. I think the only way I can be sure is I'm going to finish it in the third person,
Mhm.
and then I'm going to write it over again in the first person, and I'm going to consider the two of them and
Yeah.
try and decide which is correct in order to properly convey the story. Do I want the impact? Because I do a very close third person, so
Mhm.
close that you could almost consider it almost the first person. You're
Right.
so in the stream of consciousness in their heads. But I didn't know if I wanted to be more of an I story that the person experiences
Mhm.
as opposed to a her she story.
Of
So
course, first person does limit your viewpoint very, very tightly,
yes, yes.
and that's quite a discipline, quite an exercise to do for a discipline for an author to turn it into a first person. So I'd
I
be
know. So
very
yeah, so it is not as simple as some people might think.
no.
You don't just go through and do auto replace and change she and her to I and me or whatever. But I'm not quite sure because I was contemplating. I woke up thinking of the very last sentence. This is one of the rare stories that I knew what the last sentence should be,
Mm.
and I said, "Well, do I actually want them to be realizing it before they speak it and not hear them speak it, or do I want to describe it coming into this person's head, which he's about to say?" And I'm not sure. So I'm literally going to have two side by side 5,000 word. Well, who knows what the length differentiation will be, but that's the one I'm working on uh, right now. I can only do one thing at a time. I don't know if we had discussions about this in the past before, but if I have to either finish a story or completely abandon it and say this is point, and I very rarely completely
Mhm.
abandon something because I really don't begin it until I enjoy the journey. It may be a failure, but I see my way uh, to an ending. But that's the one I'm working on now. I don't think it'll be finished this year. I did complete 7 stories this year.
Great.
So I have 7 new ones floating around. I've sold 4 short stories this year, and hopefully to help people who think, "Oh no, I got rejected. Should I give up?" I may have broken the record this year for the number of rejections in a single year. My current annual record is 72 rejections in
Wow.
2022, and I may have crept over that. Well, if you write more than you sell, like as I said, wrote 7 this year and I sold 4, so that's 3 unsold. And I
Yeah.
think I have about a dozen stories circulating, and I get them out in the mail the minute they come. Not mail, no mail. Who sends them in the mail? I get them out in the email. I try and resubmit them the same day, if I can. This goes to some of the changes in publishing that we're talking about. In the old days,
Yes.
probably, how old were those old? These are not that old. I mean, up until a decade ago,
Mhm.
I would say most magazines were generally open. If they were open, they were open. If they weren't, I will only read stories the first week of every quarter. I only
Mhm.
read stories the first week of every 6 months, or will be open for 2 weeks once a year. I think there's one magazine that says, "Oh, our submission link will be open the first week of every quarter until we get 1,000 stories, and then it shuts down." So it does mean the process as a writer of having to decide where to send the story to is much more complicated. Let's say I go home after this conversation, or I check my email, and I have a rejected story, and I say,
Mhm.
"Well, what do I do with it?" Oh, it's not the first week of the month anymore. Do I wait until January 1st for a different market to open to send the story to, as opposed to in the past I could just send it wherever I wanted that might happen to be open? Or there are other markets that say, once I reject you, don't resubmit another story for 30 days.
Mhm.
So the stories that you have to sort of have this grid of where am I sending what story when, and there's a story that I just happened to sell to Dreamforge, this wonderful magazine that has published 2 stories of mine before, and I think they were only open for 7 days. I don't know if it was the beginning of September, I think, or the beginning of October, and for 7 days, and they take stories that are hopeful, that are meant to make people feel better about themselves, and they can deal with what life's throwing at them. So let's say we were in the middle of those 7 days and I didn't have this particular story available, or let's say this particular story was available after the 7 days were over. What do I do with it? Do I submit it somewhere else? Do I wait 6 months until they open up again because they seem such a perfect market for it?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
the job of a writer has changed quite a bit
Yes. Yes.
in order to interpolate the habits of the individual markets into their own writing. And one useful thing is think of your career, not your individual story. When you've got a dozen stories
Very much.
going on, no one rejection or one acceptance or the fate of one story matters as much. So don't just sit around looking at your mailbox as much as I do, and I say, "Gee, it's been 90 days already. Why didn't those people reply?" If you're in this for the long haul, it's a career. No individual thing, to me anyway, can carry that much weight. That's one of the techniques of not investing that much
Yes.
into. And of course, with novels, it's harder. Again, you might have spent years on your novel. You might have had
Yeah.
1 or 2 novels circulating, while I, in the same period of time, could have written 20 short stories
Yep.
circulating. So the rejection diffuses among all those short stories, and it becomes emotionally easier to deal with.
Mhm. It is emotionally easier to deal with it, but one of my tricks is as soon as I finish a book, I know what book I'm going to be working on the very next
Uh-huh.
morning. Um, because otherwise I do go into what I call postpartum depression, where
Mhm.
because I've been living with these characters. You know, the book I should be finishing within the next couple of months. I've been working on for 5 years. So I've been living with these 6 women for
Uh-huh.
all that time. They're my best friends. They, like you, they haunt my dreams, they haunt my subconscious. They're with me all through the day. There are times when you might run into me and I don't have anything to say to you because I'm in conversation
Yes,
with these
yes.
women. And but I always know what my next story is going to be
Yeah, but
before I finish it.
I have a long list of about 75, because
Yeah.
I always wake up in the middle of the night. Oh, that would make a fun story. This would make a
Yes.
fun story. Here's a
Exactly.
story that I just published in Michael Bailey published an anthology called Qualia New, Qualianous 2. It's the second volume, and the first one I think won the Stoker Award.
Mhm.
The novelette I published there, uh, An Invitation for the Uninvited, I was a story I had been working on or not working on for 30 years.
Yes.
In
Yes.
that I never wrote a single word of it, but there was a philosophical conceit
Mm-hmm.
that I said there has to be a way to tell a story about this feeling and
Yeah.
concept,
Yeah.
and I had no idea how to embody it in a character because you can otherwise it's just a polemic
Yes.
if you're writing a philosophy book or something like that. It had to be clothed in characters and situations, and you had to make people feel and laugh
Mm-hmm.
and cry and
Mm-hmm.
all that.
Yes.
And it didn't come to me until a year ago after lugging this idea around. I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
working at it, I wasn't banging my head against it.
No.
I just have again that notebook with list of story after story after
Mm-hmm.
story
Mm-hmm.
idea. When I finish a story, I sort of run my eyes down the page and say, is any of these interesting now? And
Right.
maybe there won't be one. And so this is a story that literally it's got to be at least 30 years. And I finally figured out a story that went with it. And it just came out in and I think in October. And that,
Marvelous. That's marvelous.
so
Well, this has been great fun, Scott. Thank you
I know,
so
wind
much.
me up, and you're not gonna, we
I love
go
it.
on for days. So it could just be a live stream we could be like a telethon for 24 hours.
We'll have to do it again sometime, because I know you have more stories to share and more advice and wisdom. You've seen a lot about this world of writing and editing and publishing, and I always find what you have to say entertaining and fun and interesting and makes me think. So I thank you for
Thank
all of
you. And
that.
it's always wonderful to spend time with you. I was trying to think when we first met. It's been decades.
It's been a long time.
I remember sitting at a room party with you and Daniel at a PhilCon. I haven't been to a PhilCon since I left
No.
Philadelphia, so that could be 20 years.
Yeah.
I'm not sure when I left Philadelphia, but it's been longer than that. And just talking late into the night at convention. So it could be easily 25 years or more. I'm not sure which PhilCon it was, but I remember the old Adams Mark Hotel, which was
Oh, that was great when it was there. Yes.
a long, long time ago.
Yes.
So this is wonderful. Thanks for having me.
And thank you. My guest today was Scott Edelman. I highly recommend checking any of his work. They're all great. His newest book is Things That Never Happened. Do a Google or Amazon search and will yield numerous stories and books. Try any of them. The entry drug is any of those books, and you'll enjoy being with it. He has others scheduled to be published in various magazines like Dreamforge. His website is scottedelman.com. You can find his delightful Eating the Fantastic podcast at eatingthefantastic.com or on Apple Podcasts. You can also connect with him on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, and a new one to me, wandering.shop.
That's Mastodon.
Oh, okay. As for me, my newest book is Of Being Woman, a collection of feminist science fiction from Noble Fusion Press. And Vaiit Publishing will soon be releasing Daughters of Eve, an essay-based workbook that energizes discussions about the nature of living in the 21st century through the lens of stories of the women of the Hebrew Bible, such as Eve, Rebecca, Deborah, and so forth. And no, it's not a religious book. It's just looking at the female archetypes of our civilization. My videos are on YouTube, and you can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and sometimes on Blue Sky. And eventually I'll activate my account on Substack. I don't know when I'm going to do that. Thank you very much, Scott. It was fun as always, and thank you for being here. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We look forward to connecting with you.